Welcome, and without stretching this start while everybody's coming in too far, I'm going to have now the official start of this interview. So this is Honest Conversations with Mand-Lakhiani, the co-founder of Mindvalley, one of the co-founders of Mindvalley. And today I have a very interesting and very warm and I don't even know what word to use, but very comfortable kind of guest. Sorry for the word, maybe it's not the good one, but a guest I'm very excited to interview. My guest today is Dr. Ellen Vora. Welcome, Ellen, to the show.
Thank you, Christina.
God, I got lost for the words, but what I, as I was preparing for this conversation, I realized that you're this warm person who creates a very, well, probably comfortable is the environment that you create, not you so much, who creates this very comfortable atmosphere. So I'm very pleased to welcome you on the show.
I'm so honored to be here. Thank you.
And before we start our conversation, because the conversation is not as comfortable as my guest is, the conversation is going to be, in fact, probably a little bit uncomfortable. I want to do the official start and read out the bio. So Ellen Vora, medical doctor, Dr. Ellen Vora, is a board-certified psychiatrist, acupuncturist, and yoga teacher. And she's the author of the best-selling book, The Anatomy of Anxiety. She takes a functional medicine approach to mental health, considering the whole person and addressing imbalances at the root. Dr. Vora received her BA from Yale University and her MD from Columbia University. And well, in my own words, today's guest actually combines the different worlds in medical science, both the traditional world and actually both the physical health world and the mental health world in the traditional understanding. And well, I do not know actually which one is the traditional. One of them is academic, the other one is probably traditional because it has very long roots of tradition. So maybe I'm using words a little bit unconventionally, but yes, so I have a guest who has a very holistic approach to health in short. So welcome once again. And we're going to talk about anxiety, well, the anatomy of anxiety. And I want to probably start this conversation with a question which, if you don't have the answer for that, it's fine, but I want to ask, how common is that problem actually among people? I know that when people feel anxiety, well, at least when I started feeling anxiety for the first time, I felt very lonely. I thought that I was just going crazy, and the world was spinning on as usual, and everyone is fine, and I'm the only one who is worried about something and doesn't understand what it is. How common is it really, and why do we feel lonely when we find ourselves anxious?
Yeah, if you are listening right now and you are feeling anxious, you are truly not alone. And at least, clinical anxiety in the United States, it's some 40 million Americans are struggling. But I think that really only looks at the tip of the iceberg. And there's so many times where, due to a stigma around mental health, or just because we do feel alone in our suffering, we're not even necessarily talking about it or getting diagnosed or even meeting criteria for a diagnosis. But that doesn't mean someone's not still struggling. So anxiety is incredibly common right now. And I would say, especially through the pandemic, with everything going on in the world, it's nearly universal to some degree to feel appropriately anxious.
Mm-hmm. What's the difference between feeling appropriately anxious and well, probably the opposite is not inappropriately, but
yeah,
the other way.
I realized I one of my pet peeves is ambiguous communication. And I realized as that kind of came out of my mouth, it's like, well, that doesn't really clarify the concept. What I mean by that is that when we're going through such stressful times in the world, it's appropriate to be anxious. So I'm not even really speaking to any idea of like somebody is inappropriately anxious. Like I don't really think we need that kind of shame or blame and judgment around mental health struggles. I just mean to say that it's really understandable that we're all struggling so much these days. It makes sense.
So Before we go further, since you do come from academic background as well as more old traditions in medicine, what are we talking about? Is anxiety, when we talk about anxiety, do we talk about, as you mentioned, clinical anxiety, the anxiety that is a disease, or are we talking about more everyday anxiety, something which maybe isn't diagnosable because you don't meet the criteria?
Yeah, for the purposes of today's conversation, I think we're talking about all of it. And I bristle at the way I was trained to draw distinctions between this is clinical anxiety and this is someone who's just a little bit stressed or just worrying. I think all of the suffering is valid. Of course, I might be more proactive in terms of a treatment plan with someone who's more debilitated by their anxiety. But to me, it all matters. And there isn't such a difference in kind so much as a difference in degree. And so when I'm working through how to support someone's anxiety, I don't think that one kind of anxiety could be treated with diet and lifestyle or holistic strategies, but so-called real anxiety warrants harder interventions. I actually think that identifying the root cause of the anxiety is always the correct first step, no matter how severe the anxiety. So I'm talking about what we think of as clinical anxiety, which is a really, a kind of pervasive chronic pattern of worrying and inability to relax, and can be rumination, can be racing thoughts, muscle tension, but all the way down to someone who's just subjectively identifying with that word anxiety and feeling like this is an area in their lives where they're suffering, they're struggling, and they would rather not be feeling so anxious. I think it's all valid.
And how dangerous it is actually, and why I'm asking that is that I often hear the term anxiety coupled up with depression, and we all know that depression is actually a serious thing.
Yeah,
At least I hope we all know that it is a serious thing.
So mental health issues in general actually, carry a decent burden of lethality, though it's not necessarily how you would expect, but it's, even things like eating disorders have a significant morbidity to them. Depression certainly gets concerning when someone has thoughts of harming themselves. Anxiety on its own is not one of the more dangerous diagnoses to carry, but I'm always concerned with safety as a doctor, but I'm equally concerned with quality of life. And I think that even if somebody is not at risk of dying, if they're not at risk of dying from a mental health issue, if they're at risk of missing out on being able to thrive and enjoy their day-to-day life and enjoy the people that they care about, that's a serious call to action as well. So I think that even if it's not carrying a high burden of morbidity, it matters. This is creating immense impacts on quality of life.
Mm-hmm. I think yes. It's I've had periods of anxiety, and it's not really a life when you are worried constantly, and you can't even take care of the cause because you don't always know what's the cause of it. So the question I want to ask you, I know that you make a distinction between anxiety which has a more physical origin versus an anxiety which has I don't remember the term, so I'm going to just blunder through that, but I think you call it purposeful anxiety.
Yeah, that's right.
Could you explain the distinction, and how does one understand which one is which?
Yeah, so this
What
is
do I feel right now, for example? Is it this or that?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is the central thesis of my book, and it's where I've really made a departure from how I was trained. I was trained to think about anxiety according to the so-called Bible of mental health, the DSM, which is basically it's thinking about anxiety as generalized anxiety disorder, or OCD, panic disorder with or without agoraphobia. And we need that kind of standardization for clinical research studies, but it's really seems to be intended to gatekeep our diagnoses and steer management in terms of what medication is indicated. But that's fundamentally different from how I approach mental health. So it was never really meaningfully guiding practice for me. So what I've observed through 10 years in practice is that anxiety really actually, you can categorize it in a very particular way, which is that there's two types of anxiety. What I would call false anxiety, and we'll circle back around to how that term kind of lands uncomfortable. It's like, it almost feels like it's invalidating, when it's not to invalidate the very real suffering, but just speaks to a straightforward physical basis. But false anxiety is avoidable anxiety. It's based in the physical body. It's something that has tripped our body into a stress response. And we experience this as anxiety. It doesn't need to be happening. And so that's where I get very actionable. I play Mr. Fix-It. I identify what's the root cause of this person's physical imbalance that's creating unnecessary anxiety. We chip away at it, and someone can walk away from a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Mhm.
That's the false anxiety. And on the other hand, we have what I would call true anxiety, which is purposeful anxiety. It's not something to pathologize. It's not something to suppress. And it's really not something that we can gluten-free or decaf coffee our way out of. It's
Mhm.
our inner compass. It's a true north, nudging us, asking us to slow down and get still and pay attention. Usually it's an awareness of something that we've always kind of known, but we steamroll over it in our lives, we ignore it. And there's usually a call to action baked into our true anxiety. It's asking us to get back into alignment in some way or course correct some aspect of our lives. And so this has been the most useful way for me to think about anxiety. And you asked, like, how do you tell the difference? And
Mhm.
it can be difficult, but where I always start with patients is with the false anxiety, because that's creating a lot of suffering. It doesn't need to be happening. It's not serving us in any important way. And you can chip away at it. You can basically identify potential causes of imbalance and stress. And you address that, you get it out of the way, and it kind of clears the air. And then from that place of relative clarity, you can really get still and get familiar with your true anxiety. It gets easier to identify, okay, now that I'm not physiologically being pinballed from this stress response to this state of unnecessary anxiety, when we're not in that anymore, we can tap in and hear that clarion note of our true anxiety.
So I know we dived into this topic with the assumption that, yes, we're talking about anxiety and people understand that anxiety is something that needs to be treated because it's not a pleasant life, and how to distinguish anxiety, which is false versus true anxiety. We'll actually get back to that because this is the the bulk of our conversation. But before we go into that, I actually want to ask, how do you know that you actually need help? Because sometimes people mm, normalize the idea of having stress in life, especially if you are a grown up with responsibilities, whether it's some debt in bank or children or relationships or maybe health issues. We assume that stress is a normal part of life. When do you know that this is actually not just simple stress, or is there a difference? Maybe stress is the anxiety, and how do you know that this is not something you actually, that it is normal and you have to live with that? Maybe you can eliminate this. Why I'm asking this is because I live among very regular normal people who never even pause for a second to question whether this kind of environment, stressful, anxious, sometimes snappy environment, is okay, or maybe we could do better as a humanity.
Yeah, I love this question. I think it's so important to navigate this eyes wide open. So I've always believed that the amount of effort and sacrifice should be proportional to how much somebody is struggling. And so if you're just feeling a little bit anxious, you might make a little bit of effort here. And if you're really struggling, it might be worth rolling up your sleeves and really getting to work. The part I disagree with is that we right now have a very 1-0 approach to getting treatment. We say if you have real clinical debilitating anxiety, then it's worth making it past what we gatekeep, which is working with a professional, considering medication.
Mhm.
And I think it is reasonable to gatekeep things that are more invasive. medication can be invasive, it can have side effects. Working with a professional can be expensive, it can take a lot of time. And even that process, if anyone here has attempted that, I know it's different in different countries around the world. In a place like the United States, where we don't have state-sponsored healthcare, it can be an immensely challenging process to get care, especially affordable care with somebody in your area who's working with your insurance, with whom you feel like you have good chemistry. That can be so many barriers and obstacles and hoops to jump through. And even once you make it through, we have variable efficacy in terms of our interventions. So the way I think about this, it's so fundamentally different. I think that we have been thinking about mental health incorrectly. And we've all been taught that our mental health issues are the result of a genetic chemical imbalance. And we focus on it from the neck up. We just think about our brain chemistry, our thoughts, and that the treatments for that are medication and psychotherapy. And we have, if that's helpful for one person, that's great. I count that as a victory. There's many millions of people for whom that approach has not been adequately effective. They haven't gotten satisfactory results. And I think my field has been doing a disservice to the population because we have had too narrow of a menu of offerings. To say something is a genetic chemical imbalance, it implies it's your destiny, that it's a fixed trait, and that medication is really the only way to support that. But we've been overlooking this whole other list of determinants of our mental health. And that's everything from the quality of our sleep to our nutritional status, whether or not we're inflamed, the health of our gut, the balance of our hormones, and all the way to more psycho-spiritual dimensions of our mental health, like our fundamental human need for community and to be of service and to have some sense of meaning and purpose in our lives. And when we expand our understanding to recognize that all of these things are also influencing our mental health, that actually gives us reason for hope, because we can make adjustments here. And there's nothing invasive about that. There's often nothing even expensive about that. It's just a shift in our diet, our lifestyle, and our priorities. And we can actually support our mental health in ways that are accessible, safe, affordable, and make a big difference. So all of this is to say, if someone's asking themselves right now, like, should I get help? I think the question of whether or not to embark upon seeking professional help, it kind of comes down to if it's accessible to you, if you have that within range, and then, certainly if there's questions of safety. But for everyone, I don't think there's any reason to not give some diet and lifestyle strategies a try, because it's easy, it's safe, it has side benefits instead of side effects, and you can start today and make little adjustments, and these can make a big difference in how much you're suffering. So I don't think we have to gatekeep the diet and lifestyle holistic approach to supporting our mental health.
So my question naturally is, and I haven't done research, so I'm going to improvise, but would it be safe to assume that that with the changes in lifestyle of us as a society, our mental health also changes? Why I'm saying that, as I mentioned, it's really dark in Estonia in winter. So what I do is that I go out for a walk in the middle of the day so that I get a little bit of sunshine. And I did that in the days of COVID when I had a lot of spare time on my hands. But as I went out for a walk today, I actually forced myself. I realized that it's such a good, emotionally good thing to do. I remember when my mom lost her sister, it was a year ago, I forced her to go out on a walk with me, and she was reluctant, but when she came back, she said, oh, it was very refreshing and very good. And I was thinking, I think about everything. Every single thing that I do, I have to analyze and think about it. So I was thinking about how our lifestyles have actually deprived us of a lot of things that we used to do in the old days. Like I was in a taxi going to my massage, and I was listening to a lady talking about handicrafts, and it dawned on me that doing things with hands actually was the beginning probably of us as human race evolving out of animals into what we are right now. And we don't do any of that. We are separated from that, would it be safe to assume that the changes in lifestyle of a contemporary human being who lives in the city, and I'm talking about mostly city living, affect our mental well-being? And is there anything good that has happened to us?
I mean, I think it's such a smart question. I think you're spot on. Here's how I think about this. This is an operating system for how I understand mental health. It's called an ancestral lens, but it's basically understanding without bringing any kind of moral judgment on this. This isn't like a moral discussion. This is about our genes. And that if you kind of put human evolution along the width of this screen, it's like, here are millennia of human evolution. And that here we are right now, like the width of a piece of paper at the edge of the screen. And so our lifestyle has changed so profoundly in such a relatively short amount of time. And our genes have not adapted to it yet. We're adapted to how life was like for this period of time. And so it makes sense to do our best to approximate certain conditions that are more consistent with what our genes evolved to be adapted to. And I'm not actually saying that I would like to go back to the proverbial savanna of evolution. Like that was hard living, there's real threats to survival, getting enough to eat. It's not like we want to go backwards, but I think we do have the opportunity to kind of have the best of both worlds in modern life. We just have to be conscious about all of this default programming that has us living so out of step with what our genes are adapted to. So like I love that example of working with our hands. We have to craft, we have to make. This is inherently human. I think that even our relationship to light is really important. And right now you see so many people so strung out. And part of the reason we're all so strung out is that we don't get the right amount of sleep and the right quality of sleep. Our sleep architecture is disrupted. And that's because the light cues that we're getting in modern life are so different from how we evolved to understand day and night. And our whole circadian rhythm or sleep-wake cycle is cued by light, which is a brilliant design for the proverbial savanna of evolution, because it was by definition light out during the day and by definition really dark at night. You could see some fire, you could see moonlight, but you were not going to be surrounded by the psychedelic light show of modern life after sunset, where we now have a laptop and an overhead light, and we bring our phone to the bed. And it's, we even have ambient light pollution outside our windows. And so all of this is suppressing our melatonin, it's disrupting our circadian rhythm, and we're not sleeping appropriately at night. And this is contributing to every mental health issue. And so even just approximating some of the light conditions of how we evolved is really helpful to preserving sleep and preserving mental health. And it starts first thing in the morning, or like you're doing right now, making sure you're getting exposure to sunshine early in the day, in the middle of the day, giving your brain that cue. It tells your brain, this is this time of day. But I think perhaps one of the most profound things we can do is to have some kind of blue blocking glasses that we put on after sunset, so that even though we live in the modern world and we have artificial light after sunset, this will block blue spectrum light from getting into our eyes and suppressing our melatonin. So this is a very impactful intervention. And I think community is another big one, where we're living so out of sync with what we evolved to have. Well, also that, but community.
Community. Oh my God, I was like, yes.
But we could talk about humility too. But I think that community, like I think on the evolutionary savanna, we weren't the strongest species and we weren't the fastest species. We were the species that figured out how to cooperate with each other. And I think that's why we prevailed. And it's for this reason, I believe, that it's hardwired in us that when we feel held in community and richly connected, we feel safe. And when we feel isolated, disconnected, ostracized, on some level, it feels like it's a matter of life or death. And so we just want to get the best of both worlds, have a hot shower, have a safe home, not have to contend with leopards. These are nice aspects of modern life. But can we also give our brains and give our bodies what optimizes them to function well?
As you were talking, I remember before I used to have a tradition of going to the Amazon rainforest. I've been there quite a few times. And the interesting thing I've noticed is that every time I land in Ecuador, because I go there from Ecuador, I start waking up at 5 a.m. and going to sleep at 8 p.m.
Yeah.
And it's just like miracle. And I always, all my life, I thought I cannot wake up in the morning, but there it just works because it's well, they some tribes there in the Amazon still live the very traditional lifestyle.
Yeah.
But back to modern life. I had a conversation with a friend just yesterday, and my friend was telling me that he's very busy, and it's such a stressful time right now because so much work is happening. And this is a recurring theme. When people feel stressed and anxiety starts coming in, removing yourself from that environment seems like it's adding more stress. I used to jokingly say all my life that when you have too much work to do, you have to sit quiet for a while, and then notice what of the work is left on the surface. I've had that habit since I was very young. In my first work assignment, somehow it helped me throughout my life not to burn out. But I know that whenever I say this advice, all my friends laugh at me and say that no, that's not the time. So how do you break this vicious cycle? Because obviously when you are too stressed, that's exactly when you need to get out of it. But that's also when you can't get out of it.
Yeah, I don't know if this story is apocryphal or not, but supposedly Jon Kabat-Zinn, kind of one of the godfathers of the mindfulness meditation movement, he famously was asked he was giving a talk, and someone was like, well, how long should I meditate every day? And he kind of shrugs and he's like, I don't know, 5 minutes. And the person's like, well, I don't have 5 minutes. And then he says, well, then I guess an hour. And I feel like that really speaks to the fact that when we get stuck in the vicious cycles of a scarcity mindset with our time, with our enoughness, when we feel like we are not enough, we don't have enough, we won't be enough, that really jams up our resourceful thinking, our creativity, our ability to make a meaningful contribution. And so I do find myself, when I feel most overwhelmed and most getting into that scarcity mindset, I very deliberately reclaim time, almost faking an abundance mindset. So when I feel like I'm drowning in work, I go for a walk outside for 5 or 10 minutes, not because I have 5 or 10 minutes to spare, but because I can feel that scarcity mindset encroaching on my ability to be clear and to be useful and helpful with my patients and when I'm speaking. And so I think that it does ask of us right now to be somewhat revolutionary in how much we participate in the never-ending hustle of 24/7 busyness. And I encourage people little by little to just play around with that. How much of it is true and how much of it is a mindset and a kind of participating in it and perpetuating it. And so when we feel most overwhelmed, you reclaim some time and you actually start removing things from your schedule, removing things from your to-do list, ignoring some things in your inbox. You basically not perform at this 150% effort that we always do. You dial it back to 85% effort in order to protect the real goal, which I believe is our highest and greatest contribution. And I think that when we're carrying out that goal, not only is that our most meaningful impact in the world, but we stay intact and we are fulfilled when we're engaging in that kind of work. And it doesn't happen when we are running at 150% effort and constantly stressed and overwhelmed.
Mm-hmm. I'm sorry that I moved this conversation into stress, but I do feel that anxiety and stress are quite closely connected, and maybe we don't always use the right terms on how we feel. And in fact, probably stress is not even a good word because it's such an umbrella term, which probably doesn't even reflect every nuance of how stress can express itself. But I still want to talk a little bit about the vicious cycle of being overworked and stressed. Another reason why, or another explanation that I hear sometimes in my environment, and I'm surrounded by a lot of people who are ambitious and achieve like high achievers and cool people. But what I hear is almost like this faith that you have to hustle to succeed. And it's a price you pay for achievement? How can you break out of this? Because what I'm leading to is that it's easy to explain to a person that they need to take a break and go for a walk when their health is starting to suffer. But before they crash, actually, literally crash, it's very hard to convince anyone, and people, even if they talk to you, I don't think they deep inside agree with you that it is important to take a break, to slow down, because there is this universal understanding in our contemporary society, Western society, that to achieve anything, to be worthy, to be productive, to be to be a contemporary human being, you have to hustle. And when I lived in New York, which was a long time ago, when people were asked how are you doing, they would say 24/7, and I would, like, it took me a year before I understood what they meant. Coming from the former Soviet Union, it didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think that I mean, one can hustle to succeed. I think that is certainly a viable path. But going back to what you were saying about humans needing to build and make something with their hands, I think that a big part of what are we calling success, which is its own, like, worth unpacking on a philosophical level. But I think if we want to carry out our unique gifts and contribution, what we really we are creatives, we're artists. And there's no white knuckling that process. It certainly requires a certain amount of showing up and discipline and often getting out of our own way. But I think it also requires enough spaciousness that our creative insights can bubble up and emerge. And so I think that we're very much in this culture of feeling so all powerful, and that if something's going to happen, it's going to come down to our effort and our white knuckling and our micromanaging of the outcome. And I actually think we've got it wrong. And I think a much healthier way to go about this is to loosen our grip. And I love the Hindu philosophy of something called karma yoga, which loosely translates into you show up and you do the right thing for the sake of doing the right thing. And then you remain unattached from the outcome. And I think that that is something to live by professionally, even, is that you're showing up and doing your reasonable best, not your bend yourself into a pretzel, squeeze out any possibility of failure, 150% effort best. That's a recipe for burnout. But you're doing your reasonable best, something you can feel proud of, but that can do sustainably. And that's more like an 85% effort. And if you show up and do your reasonable best, you can let go. And something can go well, and that's great. And something can go badly, and that's also okay. And we tend to call ourselves failures and have a lot of negative self-talk when something fails. But you have to come back to the framing, which is that my responsibility here was just the process, not the outcome. My responsibility was showing up and doing my reasonable best. Did I do that? Yes. Did it go badly? Yes. Okay, I did my best. That's enough. And every time there is a so-called failure, it's an opportunity to learn. We can be open to that feedback. We can grow and change from that. But it's not a reason to yell at ourselves, to feel like we can't do anything right. And I think that just softening around this, recognizing that we are responsible for the process, which is to show up and do our reasonable best, not only keeps us intact and less burned out, but I think it creates the spaciousness and the softness for us to just create what we need to. And this also connects back, as soon as you said humans, we need to create and make something, I thought about my daughter. She's 6 years old. And if she had her way, she would spend all day on the floor making art. And she doesn't yet have what I think Brene Brown calls an art scar, sort of that first time you make your art, you put it out into the world, and somebody tells you it's no good. And then you start to have shame and you start to become a critic of your own art and you get frustrated with your process. She just creates and doesn't think so much about whether the world thinks it's good. And I think that if we can give ourselves this softness around showing up and being responsible for doing our reasonable best, but not white knuckling the outcome, it's almost like we're 6-year-old artists again. We're not so fixated on, well, what does the world think about this? What's the outcome? What's the feedback? We're focused on, is this my truth that I'm making manifest in the world?
So as we were talking, you would say that sometimes you have to slow down to to almost force yourself to do something which feels like counterintuitive. Like when you're overwhelmed, slow down, go out for a walk. What I've seen from time to time is when people, contemporary people who are super busy, who are super achievers, when they do get a break for whatever reason, I don't know, a plane is delayed and they have to wait, they actually don't know what to do with that time that they're given. They feel anxious, antsy, they feel like they're wasting time. Now I have this hobby. Every time I wait for my plane boarding, I look around and not a single person is just sitting there and looking around. They're all trying to do something. How do you force yourself into actually using those few breaks that we do get without feeling shame?
To me, so this calls on the Taoist symbol of the yin yang. And if you can picture the yin yang, this is a balance, a dynamic equilibrium between the yang aspect, that's our masculine aspect, sun energy, productivity, doing. That is, of course, the part that our culture is obsessed with. But for such a long time, they have appreciated that exists in perfect dynamic equilibrium with the yin aspect. This is the feminine moon aspect, that's rest, receptivity, non-doing. And we culturally have completely come to devalue this aspect of the balance. And so I think we need to just get wide awake about the fact that we're living in a state of yang imbalance, and we obsess over productivity. And even if you catch somebody seemingly valuing the yin, the rest, if you look closer, we're doing that in service of productivity. We're saying, okay, I'm going to meditate so that I can be more focused, or I'm going to get a good night's sleep so I can do a good job on the talk tomorrow. We're not valuing rest, leisure, non-doing in its own right, for its own sake. So I think we need to change our mindset and start to appreciate this is worthy of fiercely and unapologetically protecting. And it's a worthy use of our time, even if it's not in service of our productivity. So if your flight gets canceled or delayed and you're sitting in the airport and you're just thinking, I have so much to get done and I'm not at my laptop and I need to be, then, just cancel that noise and recognize that this is something to relish, is a time to just zone out, be bored, be with yourself, contemplate what's on your mind, contemplate your truth. And I mean, an airport isn't the most relaxing environment to do that, but basically mental health fundamentally comes down to meeting life on its terms. And we always want to catch ourselves resisting our reality. When we are resisting reality, this is a recipe for suffering. And if your flight just got delayed, that is your current reality. Living in resistance of that is not fruitful. It doesn't help you, it doesn't help anybody. Radically accepting, okay, so the world just gave me a 45-minute setback in terms of my productivity, but also a 45-minute bonus in terms of my ability to just sit in stillness and give my brain a little bit of a defrag opportunity. Then you embrace that. And I think that we can just start to recognize the value of that, and it helps us lean in and radically accept those times when we can't be productive, where it's better to not be productive. And I think it can come to be a beautiful thing. We are uncomfortable with our own thoughts. I think this has to do with our upbringing. We've all come of age in this emotion phobic world where if you have a kid having a meltdown, you think, make this stop, make it go away. And you hand the kid an iPad, or you hand the kid something sweet or something to distract them. And we systematically teach our children, and we've been taught, your big feelings are too much. Distract yourself, numb yourself, find something to take you out of that. And I think that we've all grown up thinking, I can't ride the waves of my big feelings. And I think we want to repair that for ourselves. And when we are in a meltdown, when we are having a big cry, can we actually be okay with that? Can we dive into it and let it be full and complete, rather than thinking, I gotta numb, I have to escape, I have to distract? Can we start to practice just staying with ourselves through the stormy weather?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. It was such a beautiful answer. And I somehow imagined a crying kid on the airplane. And we have Wendy. We have Wendy joining us. Wendy, if you can switch on either video and voice, or just a voice, you can join us in the conversation. Hey,
Hi.
Wendy.
Hi, Wendy.
Hi. So my question was, how do you stop yourself from going, when you're having great anxiety, and the next thing you're going into this massive panic attack, and like I've been in therapy for a few years, but I still haven't got to find a way that I stop myself from going into these massive panic attacks where you just want to curl into a ball or hide in the closet, or if I'm at the grocery store and I'm having anxiety about too many people being around, I just freeze, and I'm like, oh, get away from me. Like, how do you stop that from happening?
Yeah, Wendy, I love this question. Thank you for this. So let's actually separate anxiety into sort of two phases. Over here, we have everything leading up to this panic attack. And over here, we have what I would call the point of no return, where you've headed into it. And this phase, prevention, this is where I excel. I think I have a lot of ideas about how to support this phase. This point of no return phase, I'm like below average as psychiatrists go. The book I recommend for this phase is a book called Dare by Barry McDonough, I think it is. And it's a wonderful way of completely changing your stance towards panic. Cognitive behavioral therapy, I think, is also really helpful here. But I actually think that where you're going to really move the needle and make the biggest difference in your tendency toward panic attacks is in the prevention phase. And that is all of the millions of details that are impacting your physical health, your physiology, and how that's leading toward the panic attack. And that's where I think we roll up our sleeves and start to change your physical balance. And so we haven't spent a lot of time on the kind of actionable pearls and takeaways and the things that we can do, but just to throw a couple out there quickly, I think that keeping blood sugar stable can be preventative of a lot of unnecessary panic attacks. And that pertains to the fact that in our modern diet, where we're eating refined carbohydrates and coffee drinks that are secretly milkshakes and rosé all day, and everything that's coming at us in every direction, it is very conducive to a blood sugar roller coaster. And so our blood sugar spikes, and then that's chased by insulin, and then our blood sugar crashes. And a blood sugar crash, from the perspective of the body, is a matter of life or death. And the design of the body is to respond by secreting our stress hormones, adrenaline and cortisol. That cues the liver to break down the storage of starch that it keeps. It restores our blood sugar to normal levels. It saves the day, but it happens to be a 5-alarm fire stress response in the body. And that can feel identical to anxiety and panic. And so keeping your blood sugar stable can prevent a lot of panic. And there's two main ways to approach this. There's like the definitive solution, which is a more blood sugar stabilizing diet, more healthy fats, more protein, getting your carbohydrates from starchy vegetables rather than refined carbohydrates. That's a whole process, but that can be and that can be quite a process. Starting with a hack, like taking a spoonful of almond butter or coconut oil in anticipation of your typical blood sugar crashes, can give you this safety net of stable blood sugar. And so a lot of my patients with panic disorder, what I have them do is they just start taking a spoonful of coconut oil or almond butter or ghee or butter. It's really whatever you like, every few hours. And then usually that's actually eliminating a lot of their panic symptoms. And then we start to tweak it and figure out where are their typical blood sugar crashes. So if you know that you panic every day at 5:30 p.m., maybe that you're taking your spoonful at 4 p.m. And some of my patients take this right before they brush their teeth at night. It helps them stay asleep through the night. So keeping blood sugar stable is a great technique. There's a less fun conversation to be had around caffeine and alcohol consumption. That's,
we should totally have it.
to have that conversation.
Yeah, I am not, I like my own train of thought. Sometimes I don't talk about what I promised to talk about. So let's talk about the actual things we can do to prevent anxiety, which I understand is more, you're talking about right now, the false anxiety, right?
Yeah, I mean, basically, this is about the false anxiety, and it's operating under the assumption that our panic attacks happen when our body gets tipped into a stress response. And there's a lot that we can do to prevent our body getting tipped into a stress response. And it doesn't just have to do with stressful things in our lives. That's really what I would call our stressors. And stressors are going to happen always. But stress response physiologically can be caused by all these states of imbalance on a physical level. So the blood sugar crash is one of them. Caffeine, I'm sad to say, is another common source of a physical stress response. And I don't think there's anything inherently bad with caffeine. We just need to recognize that there's a lot of bioindividuality when it comes to it. And some of us are sensitive to caffeine, we're slow metabolizers, and then it can impact our sleep, and it can put our nervous system into a sympathetic fight or flight tone, which makes us more likely to have a panic attack. Alcohol has its own kind of, to sort of nerd out on the physiology with that. When we drink alcohol, part of the reason we like it is that it rushes our brain with a neurotransmitter called GABA. And GABA is really the opposite of panic. It's like the neurotransmitter that helps us feel calm and okay. And that's why we like alcohol. And if the story ended there, I would say alcohol is a great treatment for panic and anxiety. But unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. And our brain is not so concerned with whether or not we're calm. It's concerned with our survival. So it takes that GABA and it furiously converts it to a different neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. This is its attempt to restore homeostasis. So this, I believe, accounts for why when we've had a couple of drinks at dinner, inevitably we wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning and we have racing thoughts, we have a racing heart rate, and then we toss and turn and have lousy sleep for the remainder of the night, which is that GABA to glutamate conversion. And that is why we now have this term hangxiety, like anxiety we get when we have a hangover. And so alcohol basically directly contributes to feeling more anxious the next day. And that's independent of the fact that it's also disrupting our sleep quality, which on its own creates more anxiety the next day. So these are a couple quick thoughts. I think magnesium supplementation at bedtime can also be really helpful to preventing panic. So there's a lot of things you can do. I think most importantly, Wendy, I just want you to know there's hope. You don't need to keep having these panic attacks. It's so exquisitely painful and difficult to go through life constantly in and out of panic, and you can find relief. And so I really hope that some of these strategies feel resonant, feel accessible, and can help you just very dramatically change your daily quality of life. Thank you for your question.
Can I just ask one more thing? Like,
Yeah.
I don't drink alcohol. I don't drink coffee. I rarely ever have sugar. But like, I start to panic when I have an idea that I have to go meet somebody.
Yeah.
You know, like, okay, say if I knew that my father was coming to town and he wants to see me. Well, that automatically, my anxiety level goes high, and then I start to panic because I know that if we meet, then it's going to be like unbelievably crazy, you know, and hard, and so how do you stop those kind of things?
Yeah, I'm so glad you clarified. And in certain ways, like your question served as an example for all these other types of false anxiety that don't directly apply to you. Hopefully they were helpful and resonant for somebody listening. But I think in your case, it's probably more along the lines of, one thing is that we get into habits and patterns. So I still maintain a belief that there's probably something physical to your anxiety. For you, it's not going to be caffeine and alcohol. Blood sugar doesn't necessarily go one-on-one with whether or not you consume sugar. It can relate to just metabolic flexibility. But I think that for you, it could be chronic sleep deprivation. It could be inflammation. You could just be mineral deficient, and maybe you want to take like minerals in the morning. It could be one of these various things. But then you develop a pattern of associations of anxiety in the social anxiety context. And so then it's almost like, this is where Judson Brewer's book called Unwinding Anxiety can be really useful in sort of changing your pattern around that anxiety. But I also think that when it comes to social anxiety, this can be deep, and this can be part of all of our conditioning throughout our lives, especially I think for women, where we're conditioned to say yes, to be people pleasers, to not disappoint people, to compromise our own energetic needs in order to keep the peace or meet everyone else's needs. And I think that that constant exhaustion and pull at our energy, and then also that it necessitates a constant betrayal of the self, because we basically hear our true no inside, our body saying like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to, this is exhausting for me. And yet we find ourselves having to say yes. And then we feel, it's almost like then we need couples therapy with our own bodies and our own selves. It's like, why do you keep betraying my needs? And so we need to come back and have a reparative relationship with ourselves. So I think that social anxiety can sometimes be around all those expectations on ourselves. So for this, I think the book is Melissa Urban's book called The Book of Boundaries, where, and also the original, which is Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. I can type these into the chat at the end if that's helpful. And for anyone else, and that's where you just want to start getting a script for how do you speak up for your own needs and recognize your worthiness of getting those needs met. And I think that is actually really at the heart of a lot of social anxiety. So Wendy, I so appreciate this question. I hope something in this is helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Wendy, for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's always a pleasure when you guys join us in our conversation. Unfortunately, I wasn't paying attention so much to the time because I think the conversation was, well, to me, very interesting. And I want to do the traditional thing. Since we are going to be finishing now, I want to ask the people who are online to leave a heart for my wonderful guest in the chat, and those who are not online, who are going to be watching it in recording, then you can leave it under the video. And what I want to ask is Ellen, if people want to work with you, what's the best way? How do they go? Well, how do they go about it?
Yeah, and I just put into the chat that I think all the names of each of those books that I just mentioned. And in case anybody wants to sort of focus on more of that false anxiety, true anxiety approach, that's my book, which is The Anatomy of Anxiety. So working with me, basically, I'm not taking new patients for my individual practice, but I'm starting online groups this winter. So if somebody wants to participate in one of those, just to come to my website and join the mailing list, and that's how you'll be notified when those open up for enrollment. And I'm pretty active on Instagram. I'm at Ellen Vora, MD. And so I'm always trying to kind of give different pearls and suggestions for supporting mental health over there.
Yes, I would recommend Instagram for sure, because you'll get the real taste of Ellen there, and a lot of really, really good ideas in a very easy form. So definitely a good place to go. Since we were actually efficient in closing, I want to ask one more thing. You know, I've noticed an interesting thing. We were talking about the sleep here, about sleep and how caffeine and alcohol actually disrupts our sleep patterns, and lack of good sleep contributes to us feeling anxious. I have noticed an interesting thing which started happening with age. Before, when I went out partying, dancing, whatever, hanging with friends, I would come home anytime and I just fall asleep. Now I've noticed, even without the parties, I maybe just doing an interview until very late. If I go to bed after a certain time, let's say after 1 or 2, I'm exhausted physically, but I can't fall asleep. Is there an explanation to that? And I'm sure it does influence anxiety levels.
Yes, I love this question. There is absolutely an explanation there. So this is something that a lot of us learn the hard way when we have babies, which is the concept of overtired. So if you don't have kids, you hear this term overtired. You're like, that's not a thing. There's tired and there's more tired. But when you have a baby, you start to learn their tired signs, where they rub their eyes and they yawn, and it's all so cute, but it's actually quite an urgent situation. So you need to drop whatever you're doing, change their diaper, and get them down for their nap before it's too late. because that's a sweet spot when they're perfectly tired. And if you push past that, they get what's called overtired, where they're arching their back and emanating heat, crying inconsolably. And we adults are really just oversized toddlers in so many ways. And we also have a sweet spot when we're perfectly tired. And if we go to bed at that time, we fall asleep easily, we stay asleep through the night. And we also get overtired when we push past it. And I think this is the body basically trying to support the fact that it thinks we had a good reason to not go to sleep when we were perfectly tired. So it releases cortisol, our stress hormone, to help us be on the night shift or participate in the Great Migration. And so you can start to notice your tired signs and look for it around 3 hours after sunset. So if you're in Estonia in November, that's going to be pretty early. This is hibernation season. But basically 3 hours after sunset, you start to look for when are you rubbing your eyes and yawning and staring vacantly at the wall. That's the sweet spot when it's easy to fall asleep and stay asleep through the night. And if you push past it, also start to familiarize yourself with your overtired signs, where you start to get that second wind feeling and you feel tired but wired. You almost feel warm, and then you're suddenly doing projects around the house. And when you try to fall asleep, you toss and turn. And this, I think, is such a profound, helpful learning, because we all struggle so much with falling asleep, staying asleep. And sometimes it's just a matter of going to bed a little bit earlier at that time when we're perfectly tired that can take away all of that drama around falling asleep. I do think when we're younger, we're more resilient. And as we get older, we have less wiggle room with our circadian rhythm. I'll add in
I'm sorry to push.
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm sorry to push the limits of our interview today, but I do want to ask. So, but if you do find yourself in that situation where you have to go, because sometimes it's work, sometimes it's another reason, not because you are overworking, but you're in America, I'm in Europe. It happens.
Yes.
Is there any suggestion what to do if you have shot past your optimal time?
I think that the blue blocking glasses, which can be, the kind that make you look like you're about to do metallurgy, it can look more normal. You can get a range of different kinds. That at least will prevent the melatonin suppression. So that will help you get sleepy. And then I think having any kind of ritual that cues you for sleep, so a warm shower or a warm bath, followed by entering your cold bedroom, turning on the white noise machine, taking magnesium glycinate. All of these things can help cue you for sleep, even if it's a little bit of a deviation from your typical circadian rhythm. So leverage ritual and use the other circadian cues. We have the light one is really important. And the drop in temperature is also really helpful. So going from somewhere warm to somewhere cold helps cue your body for sleep. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for patiently waiting out for all my questions. Thank you guys for joining us. And it was a very pleasant conversation. I do hope we'll see you maybe here again sometime soon.
I hope so too.
Thank you very much. And thank you everyone who joined us in the conversation. And thank you, Bianca, of course, for having our backs So we didn't have any troubles today. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. See you in a week. Bye.
Thank you, Christina. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, Bianca.